Hi, David. First off, I want to say happy birthday, man. Thanks for being a great roommate. And I guess as part of your birthday present, I decided that since I'm kind of in this video making mode, and I remember that you once asked me, "Hey, tell me about your knowledge about solar cells." I decided that it would be kind of fitting if I just made a video on solar cells. So I hope you enjoy it. So in this video, I'll be imparting some of my knowledge on solar cells that I gained through one of my summer research opportunities. I think this stuff is really cool, and I'm pretty sure that you'll find it very interesting, as you like to always say. You always find everything interesting, and that's awesome. So here we go. So if you ever open up a basic textbook, the first thing you'll see about the solar cell, oh, it just converts light energy to electrical energy. That's what a solar cell does, and that's that, you know. But really, behind all of this, there's quite a lot of stuff that's happening. And today we're going to be talking about what exactly happens behind the scenes. And some of this stuff is really cool. So let's go straight into it. First, let's think about what the types of solar cells out there are. Well, first of all, there's the crystalline silicon solar cells. If you ever look at a solar cell today, 90% chance that it's a crystalline silicon solar cell. These are the most common solar cells out there. They're the major ones that people like Solar City are manufacturing. There's also the thin film solar cells, the organic solar cells, tandem solar cells. Tandem solar cells, by the way, are the ones that are breaking efficiency barriers. These are like high power solar cells, but they're also pretty expensive. Then there are also cadmium telluride solar cells, and then there's of course these solar cells that I worked with in my summer at UTD called the dye-sensitized solar cells. And today, I'll be mainly talking about the crystalline silicon solar cells and dye-sensitized solar cells. I do know some about the rest of these solar cells, but I would say that these two topics are the ones I know most about because I spent most of my summer researching about these two. I know the most about dye-sensitized because that's what my project was, but I also had to know quite a bit about crystalline silicon solar cells because these are the solar cells that everyone compares. Whatever project you're doing, the performance is always compared against the crystalline silicon solar cell. So I had to know quite a bit about this one as well. So let's start with the crystalline silicon solar cell. So this is nice, actually not really that nice of a diagram, but it's a schematic of the solar cell. I tried to find a color one, but none of them were actually right, so this is what we get. But basically, there are three parts, mainly. There's two electrodes, and then there's an N and P material that make up something called a p-n junction, which we'll talk about. Now, what does the N and P mean? You might have seen this with NMOS transistors and PMOS transistors in E16B. And what the N means is that it's made up of an N-doped material. And the P means that it's made up of a P-doped semiconductor material. So I'll talk about this also soon, so don't worry. And then lastly, there's an external circuit. So basically the electrons move through this circuit to produce current. But before we go into all of that, let's talk about the p-n junction, because the p-n junction basically forms the basis. Basis. Okay, sorry, I make that joke too much, but anyway, the p-n junction forms the basis for all of this, all of the activity in the solar cell, creating the energy. So, what the p-n junction is made up of, it's made up of a p-doped semiconductor material and an n-doped semiconductor material. What does it mean for a material to be p-doped? Well, basically, doping is the introduction of an impurity into a structure so that we get electron movement. So in the p-doped case, we take away an electron, so basically we create an electron hole. And in the n-doped, we add an electron. And so now we have an extra electron here and a lack of an electron here, an electron hole. So when we put these materials together, what's immediately going to happen is there's going to be some diffusion that happens, because now, remember from the law of conservation of charge, we want to have equal charge. So what happens is that the electron from the n-doped moves here, and the p-doped moves here, and so the electrons rearrange themselves, but now we have electron movement. So when we have electron movement, we of course have an electric field. So this entire process creates an electric field. And this is super important because the electric field is the driving force of all the electron movement afterwards. Alright, so now let's talk about go deeper into the mechanics of how a solar cell converts light energy into electrical energy. So before I go into that though, I want to talk a little bit more about the doping, because I think this is, if you ever take E105, I think they hit this stuff hard. So it's pretty cool stuff as well. But basically, when you have a p-doped semiconductor, you usually dope it with a boron, because boron has one less electron. And remember, the p-type has an electron hole, or a lack of an electron. So when we introduce this in here, we have a lack of an electron. And then when we introduce an element like phosphorus into the silicon structure, we have an extra electron. And that, again, creates electron imbalance, and therefore movement of charge. So once we have all the movement of charge, we have basically a crystalline silicon lattice. That's why it's called crystalline silicon solar cell, because of this crystal lattice. And it's all very nice until you introduce sunlight into the equation. So what happens when you introduce sunlight? Well, basically, sunlight has energy in the form of photons, and these photons excite electrons within this crystal lattice. And now what happens when these electrons get excited? Well, now they want to get out of this lattice because they have too much energy. So the electrons that escape the lattice are now called something called excitons. And excitons are basically electron hole pairs that get removed from the crystal lattice. Now I'll talk a little bit more about the mechanisms of how it gets released from the lattice in a bit. But basically now once we have this removed electron, it now moves to the external load, which is basically whatever we're driving, whatever the solar cell is powering. So it could be a house, it could be like a phone, or whatever solar cells are used these days. So now once we have that, we have current moving through the external circuit, and once we have that, we're in business basically. Now, I'm going to go into the mechanics of how electrons get excited. So basically, every single material has this very, very important property called the band gap energy. And this is a huge part of material science. And this goes into valence band and conduction band structures. And so in quantum mechanics, we always have this area called the valence band, which is the electrons that aren't in an excited state. And then what we want to do is we want to take these electrons from the valence band, which is like the resting position, into the conduction band. Because once we excite them into the conduction band, they want to move because they have the energy to move. And so this is the electrons in the conduction band are the ones that get into the external circuit. Oh, also, one thing I forgot to mention. The process that moves the electrons into the external circuit is the electric field itself that we created when we doped silicon, when we had the p-n junction. So once we did that, well, also remember, once we removed an electron from the crystal lattice, now we have another electron that's gone. So now electrons are going to want to try to fill its place. So now we have all the electrons moving, and then again we have the sunlight that's continuously exciting electrons. So this is how this forms a continuous process. So it's not just one electron going through. Once you have one electron going through, then everything starts to move towards the external load, and that's how the current is created. And of course, once the electrons are excited, they go into conduction band. So now see, the biggest thing is that when a photon hits the solar cell, there are really three things that can happen. One being the photon just gets reflected off the solar cell. In that case, it's kind of a bummer because nothing happens. Or the photon hits the electron, but then there's another sad case where it doesn't really have enough energy to get the electron excited. And what does it mean to have enough energy? Well, the energy of the photon must be higher than the band gap energy. So as material science researchers, we want to generally have materials with a low band gap energy so more photons can hit them and get excited into the conduction band. And silicon has a pretty low band gap energy. It's in the order of magnitude of electron volts, which is like 1.6 times 10 to the negative 19 joules. Now, once we have, so that's the second case, is that the electron hits the photon hits the electron, and the electron is not excited, as in there's not enough band gap energy to excite the electron from the photon. But the third case is what we're interested in, where the photon hits the electron with an energy that is greater than the band gap energy, and the electron gets excited into the conduction band and therefore becomes an exciton. And once we have that, we have it move towards the external circuit, and that's where the current comes from. Alright, so that's the basic mechanisms of the crystalline silicon solar cell. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is the dye-sensitized solar cell, which is what I worked on throughout my summer. So the dye-sensitized solar cell structure is a little bit different from the crystalline silicon. We don't have any silicon lattice, of course, so instead what we have is 2 electrodes and an electrolyte solution, a semiconductor membrane, and a dye. And the name dye-sensitized solar cell is because of this dye, because now the dye is a source of electrons rather than the crystal lattice in silicon. And these dyes are made up of various chemicals that they work together well. But basically, the process of creating current in dye-sensitized solar cell is much more chemistry-based rather than the physics-based version of the crystalline silicon solar cell. So let's talk a little bit about that. So remember, I said the dye is the source of electrons. And so electrons are packed into one region of the dye. And again, when the sunlight hits the dye, we have photons that hit the electron. And the quantum mechanics at the end of the day are the same. As long as a photon has an energy higher than the band gap energy of this dye, or the electrons in the dye, then we're going to basically inject this electron into the conduction band. And so now the electron's going to want to move. But see, the key thing here is that now there's not really an electric field to move this electron. So how does the electron move away from the dye? Well, the process here is that it diffuses towards the semiconductor membrane, because the dye has a higher concentration of electrons, whereas the semiconductor membrane doesn't have as much. So the electron is then, by the diffusion laws, going to want to go towards the membrane, and that's exactly what we want. So here, the driving force of electron movement is diffusion, not the electric field, because dye-sensitized solar cells do not have an electric field. Alright, so once we have that, the electron is going to move through the semiconductor membrane. That's usually made up of titanium dioxide nanoparticles, and then once it reaches the end of the semiconductor membrane, it's going to go through the external circuit, and that's where we get our current, and then it's going to hit the counter electrode or cathode, and once it's here, we have an electrolyte, and what this electrolyte does is it replenishes electrons back into the dye. So what we have the electrolyte is basically a redox reaction. So on one side, it's going to accept the electron and as a result be reduction, and then on the other side, it's going to lose the electron back into the dye, and that's going to be an oxidation reaction. So this is again more chemistry related, but also in some ways it's very similar, and in some ways it's different than the crystalline silicon solar cell. So I guess one question you probably have is why even research these solar cells? Well, the reason that this solar cell is an interesting one to research is, of course, obviously the fact that this solar cell is much cheaper than the crystalline silicon solar cell. And that makes it very nice, because if we can make this a little more efficient, then it has a chance of competing with these crystalline silicon solar cells. So then the next question, obvious question, is how do you make this more efficient? Well, there are several ways to do that. One way to do that is you can make a better electrolyte. There's also a catalyst within here that speeds up this reaction. Better catalysts can increase efficiency because they speed up reactions. And then there's, of course, you can have better dyes that hold the electrons better. But what I decided to research in my summer is an interesting problem, in that I mainly looked at the semiconductor membrane of the solar cell. And here we have this titanium dioxide semiconductor membrane. So it's made up of nanoparticles. But one problem that often happens when you try to get electrons through here, well, the problem is that these titanium dioxide nanoparticles have a lot of what's called grain boundaries. And grain boundaries are these crystalline defects that are the result of intersections between the nanoparticles. So basically, on an intuitive level, if you have a place where there's not a room to get through, the electrons are not going to be able to go through. So basically what happens is these electrons are often not able to get through this membrane and end up going back into the dye. And that's a big problem, because then we're losing current. And this happens all the time within these devices. So the problem I was trying to solve is how can I make these membranes better so that electrons are able to flow through the membrane easier to get to the external circuit. And to do that, I explored both looking at a different material, and also looking at different structures, because if I had the main thing is I want to make a structure that has less grain boundaries and therefore allows electrons to flow easier. And I also wanted to look at a material that had different electrical conductivities so that it would be easier for electrons to move through this conductive material. And so what I did in my experiment is that I used zinc oxide, one with nanowires and one with a nanophore structure. The nanowire structure was interesting because even though it had less grain boundaries, it actually ended up doing worse than titanium dioxide. So what's good about titanium dioxide? Well, it has a high surface area, so it's able to hold a lot of electrons within the die. But with the nanowires, it didn't have a lot of surface area, so there's not a lot of inherent electrons in the die as a result. So with the presence of electrons within the die is something called die loading. So basically, titanium dioxide had a much better die loading, but not as good in terms of grain boundaries. So the challenge here was to find how much do I want to gain from getting better grain boundaries, and how much do I want to lose by losing some die loading. So I needed to find like a middle ground, and that ended up actually being the zinc oxide nanophore structure, in which these nanophores have basically these wires on crack, because now the wires grow wires with themselves, so it's kind of recursive, and it's a tree basically. So that's why you have this phore structure, and that has a lot more surface area than the nanowire, so it still had a pretty good die loading. And what also ended up happening is significantly reduced the grain boundaries. And zinc also is a very electrically conductive material, so it was also had a high electric conductivity. It also ended up being cheaper than titanium dioxide. So in my project, I was able to find out that this zinc oxide in the nanophore structure was a better membrane. So this was pretty cool. But yeah, so I think the coolest thing was that I only focused on this one aspect of this also. That was the only thing I was changing, and I was able to see a little bit of improvement. And in terms of measurements and doing the experimentation, you look at a lot of IV curves, and there's something called the fill factor. You of course look at the open circuit voltage, short circuit current density. Current density is a huge thing to look at, and then of course the power efficiency, calculating efficiency. There's also some cool stuff on something called the external quantum efficiency of a solar cell. And to do that, you have to do a technique called internal photoemission spectroscopy. So I got to do all this cool stuff. So, I mean, this is just the introduction to the basic how the solar cells work. And I think you probably have a lot of questions. Feel free to message me if you have any. I'd be happy to answer them. And yeah, so now you know quite a bit. You probably know more than most people do about solar cells, honestly. I think most people just know this first slide. What is that first slide? Convert light energy to electrical energy. But yeah, as you can see, there's a lot more that goes into it. And I think the coolest thing about learning these things is that you learn things on one level, and then you realize there's so much other layers to it. So I guess so to finish off, key thing to understand is that there are subtle differences between the crystalline silicon and dye-sensitized solar cells. The crystalline silicon solar cells have the built-in electric field. The dye-sensitized solar cells use diffusion of charge to facilitate electron movement. So these are like the drivers of the entire process. The electric field, it was a driver for the crystalline silicon solar cell. For the DSSC, it was diffusion. Then, the silicon structure in crystalline silicon solar cells were a source of electrons, whereas the photoelectric dye was a source of electrons for the dye-sensitized solar cell. And the picture on the left is the crystalline silicon solar cell. So this is the standard solar cells you see out there. This is what a dye-sensitized solar cell looks on the right. It's very pretty, I think. But yeah, that's the stuff I did on solar cells. Yeah, I think in terms of actually how the solar cell works, that's a pretty good overview, I think. So again, let me know if you have any questions. And of course, happy birthday. Thanks for being an awesome roommate. Can't wait to see how the next years go. It's going to be fun. Alright. Thanks for watching.